Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to kick off this morning. Just a little bit of housekeeping straight up. Once we're finished today, we're all moving back downstairs. So once this morning's finished up, in terms of our question time and presentation this morning, we're all back downstairs. So we've got that. Okay, so I'm Duncan Lawson. This project was a master's program out of Western Sydney University. Okay, it was, it's looking at basically bushfire risk. Now, the whole intent of it is how bushfire risk and how it moves into community engagement. So just keep that in the back of the mind is what about determining risk in rural communities and how that informs a community engagement program. It was funded through a successful Black Summer grant through Mid Coast Council. The program is principally led by Landcare and Mid Coast Council, together with assistance from RFS Hotspots and Western Sydney University. The principle of it all is that we've got two rural communities, Stroud and Bungalow. So people that aren't familiar with it, you're heading north out of Raymond Terrace, about an hour's up the road, go 50 k's to the east and 50 k's to the west. They're the two communities we're looking at. Quite diverse and distinct. The Bungalow community is on the coast, highly tourism, small blocks, a lot of forested vegetation, very eco-living arrangements, transitional population, tree change population. Where Stroud is an old agricultural area, a lot of cleared land, undulating country, forested areas on ridgetops, but a lot of stable landowners in that area. So we've got two different lifestyles or community profiles in those two areas that we're looking at. A distinct difference in wildfire history in those two communities that impacted those two communities. So Stroud hasn't seen much fire in the last 10, 15 years, where Bungalow has been impacted on fire. So that was an interesting little profile as well. The project was really to look at what's the perceived and what's the actual risk of bushfire in these communities and what people understood as their risk profile. So that's where it's all about. And how do we use that risk profile to better do community engagement? What's risk? Tony, what's risk? Likelihood and consequence. Exactly right. Yes. So what's likelihood and consequence of what? No? Yeah, of what value? Yeah, so that's a property value. Or the environment, that's another value. That's another value. So risk is really complex, okay? And there's just a few little pictures up there, but it's about what's the fire behaviour, what's the slopes, what's the vegetation type. That adds into risk. That's the likelihood. Land use planning, cultural values. I've got it down here. Emergency management, how that runs into risk and likelihood and consequence. It's really difficult and it's really subjective and it's different for everybody. That's the first thing that was really hard to nut through, that people all have a different profile of risk. And it all comes down to, a lot of it's around that human behaviour, and previous experience is a really big issue, and which flicked people from changing their risk profile, and very difficult to change attitudes into behaviours. People will say they understand the risk, but to actually transfer that into a behaviour that actually mitigates that risk is really difficult. And look, this is research that's pretty well known. It's nothing world-breaking, but we know it. In the bushfire world, we're trying to flick through to see where those elements are that we can actually help people understand that risk in that community engagement process. Other issues there, obviously, how wildfire suppression operations occur. What's the community composition and arrangement, age structure, emergency management procedures, how connected they are in the community. We heard yesterday about a really connected community before a disaster has a more beneficial redundancy and resilience process afterwards. And obviously the legal and insurance framework around all this that people consider. Okay, so a literature review is undertaken as part of the Masters project to inform the community engagement process. It went through all the research base, all the inquiries, or looking at previous engagement processes and strategies. It was quite an intense process. We looked at international stuff. What we did is we limited our research to basically St Ives in 2017 to current. So what we found is there's pretty well two distinct kind of periods in terms of how we analyse this. Anything pre-2016 2008 to 2016, there were certain themes that come up in those areas. Does anyone want to tell me one really obvious theme that come out of all the commissions? One thing we've done a lot of work on and we've resolved. Communication. Pardon? Yep, leave early, stay and defend. Yep, that's in there. But there's one really big one. It was about communications, messaging, and we've really improved that. So that was the consistent message coming through out of that post-fire kind of research, is that community weren't getting told stuff or understood what the messaging was. That's where the new FBI's come from, the new signage and all that kind of stuff. So there's been a real bundle of work done. Also about construction standards was upgraded in the 2018 AS395, and there's a lot of planning issues upgraded in PPP 2019. So there was a lot of issues raised in those pre-2016 years. They have kind of been sorted through, and there's been work done on that, and they've been resolved to a certain extent. So what we're seeing is from about 2017 onwards, Dr. Josh Whitaker did a lot of great work out of RFS about post-survey work, post-surveys of wildfire-affected communities. And there's a lot of stuff that he's been able to draw out, and that stuff now is starting to get reflected in research programs and stuff, as how do we actually work with that. Just an example, human behaviour is huge. People need a sensory trigger to make a decision. They need to see it, they need to feel it, they need something, they need to smell it, they need to do something. Great example, Tathra fire. The fire was coming, everyone could see the smoke. Where did everybody go? Where did the main community go? A lot of people went to the lookout. So they had a massive car jam up at the lookout because people wanted that sensory input to make a decision about risk. So we realised that a lot of this live information needs to come. So now RFS and the fire agencies are looking at how we can live feed information from the fire ground straight to the website to try to help that communication. So that's another evolution of the previous research. What we kind of come through with these main points is basically community don't know how to determine their risk. So they didn't understand what risk was, how to determine it for themselves. They constantly get this messaging of low, moderate, high, extreme, catastrophic, those kind of messaging. They see the road signs, they see all this, but they don't really know what it means. They just know bad fire, good fire. The problem that we have is that they see this messaging, they get one message about leave early if there's a fire. 3 days later, they see a fire and they say, I'm not going to leave because of that fire, because it's a low fire threat day. But it's a fire that they see, and they just link that messaging of, I've got to evacuate early, to a small fire. And they don't understand that risk profile. Okay? So there's a conflict already that we're starting to see. Community engagement currently is not working. There's this theory about nudge. So at the moment, what we're trying to do in community engagement is we pick up a community from here and we want an ultimate outcome over here in one step. It doesn't work. What we need to start looking at doing in terms of risk profiling and community engagement is nudge them along that pathway over a series of years to get a better outcome. A better outcome here to there, but we're never going to get them there. We just will never get them there. So we've just got to stop the whole process of thinking that communities are going to be totally protected from wildfire or from natural hazards. But through a process of really considered community engagement, we can move them to a better outcome. And that's an improvement. And that takes time and resources. The community weren't clear about wildfire protection measures. So what's an APZ? They knew an APZ was a cleared area, but why 20 metres? Why not 15? What's landscaping? Why can't I put my timber deck there? So they weren't really aware of the why. They knew they had to have it. They knew they'd got to get access, but they weren't around the why, the stuff underneath it. Communities weren't aware of capacity and capabilities within their community, so this is more of that community engagement, kind of working local. People will ask, where are you going to go? Have you got a place to stay? Most people had said, yes, I've got somewhere, but it's my cousin or my brother or my uncle or auntie live down in Sydney. So that's great, but that didn't help the community resilience and redundancy after because everyone was spread out. They didn't understand where they had to go if they needed help. So there's all these lack of kind of understanding shared responsibility, what actually happens. So that moves on to the next one, shared responsibility of ownership, conflicting views about who should do what, native veg clearing, riparian areas, what my requirement. Most people thought they were safe because they had grasslands around them, not forests. They didn't realise what the wildfire suppress process would be, how they access information, and that's where this communication stuff really improved in terms of websites and the apps that are available now. So that stuff has improved. And a big one was there was a mistrust of centralised authorities. It was a constant theme for rural communities. they were commonly asked the question, they had the neighbour on one side and they had an RFS member on the other side. What information are they going to accept? Now, the RFS member may be totally right and totally correct in what they're saying and spot on, and the neighbour may be a bit vague. They would always trust their neighbour because it's just a human behaviour. And one thing we really want to be one message you can take out of this presentation, human behaviour is critical. Understanding human behaviour, we're better off working with it than trying to work against it. So we just accept it. Accept people are like this and then work with those limitations and barriers to move them, nudge them to that better outcome. The typical ones, time, resources, everyone's works, everyone's got kids, everyone's got other things that they need to do and spend money on, and bushfire risk or wildfire risk falls down the ladder. And there's an issue here about when do we engage. So that's a typical one. We're working in that environment, so just be aware. Don't try to, like we say in development applications, we say, you've got to have it like this. Costs a lot of time and money, and people walk away from projects. And of course, the other one that was being talked about over the weekend, legislative requirements and insurance issues. We all know about those kind of things. So the big points there, take-home messages, understanding wildfire behaviour and the fire scenarios that will affect them personally and the broader communities. Lack of this fundamental understanding leading to the inability to understand wildfire risk. So people didn't understand the whole concept of fire runs harder up a slope than downslope. They didn't understand that the fundamental that a fire will spread quicker through a grassland than a forest area. So they weren't able to personalise the risk because they didn't understand those fundamentals. And look, they're not difficult principles. And I think there's a really big argument here to start engaging with our youth and with our people through our society, through schools, and teaching people this kind of stuff at a very core basic level to help them understand those principles. So when they grow up and they buy the house, they understand it, they get it, and they can start subjectively working out their own risk and their own risk values. What are the purposes and adequacy of protection measures? Same thing. It's very broad brush. But why do we build to BAL 19 to BAL 29? People don't understand what the 19 and 29 mean. It's all about radiant heat load. But they don't understand. They think flame zone, I'm going to get flame contact. No, not necessarily. It's just a building construction level that we've got. So these kind of, and that's part of our job as consultants and RFS in the room, is to try to communicate those issues with them so they understand the risk. The problem we have is that they go and do development afterwards. So they don't understand why that timber deck that they've just put on the back of their house is an issue, because they don't understand the fundamentals, or why they have to do subfloor enclosures in construction, things like that. They don't understand that embers are the main issue for bushfires, not the heat, it's not the flame. And a lot of them didn't understand that it's atmospheric conditions. You're not going to die of flame, you're going to die of suffocation. That's where you're going to die. People didn't realise that. The other issue is they didn't realise that once we moved them down the track a little bit and we were starting this risk profiling, everyone was concentrating around their assets, but not thinking about their evacuation route. So all of a sudden we said, right, that's great, what are you doing? Yep, they understood that. I said, rightio, if the fire's over here, what's the issue there? And then, oh geez, actually my scenario is a lot bigger than just my house now in rural communities, because have you got an alternative way to go through? Have you got a neighbour that you can go to that's got a safer location? What are you going to do about pets, your livestock? And yeah, we've touched on this one before, understanding of community, I'll go back, sorry. Understanding of community risks, capabilities, conflicting views, confusion around accountabilities. Typical stuff, we've all heard this before. The whole shared responsibility is an issue, and it's not an issue for anyone not trying. We're missing the big puzzle in the middle. It's not the only solution, but having proactive, meaningful community engagement is really, really critical. And it's not community engagement where a representative comes and says, you do this, 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 and this. It's community engagement where we go and say, what do you need to know about your risk profile? What can I tell you to inform you of how do you manage risk, how operations work, so you can make that decision with your neighbours. It's a little change in how you present to the community. That's a lot more valuable for them. At the moment, it's authorities and us going, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do that, and then your risk is mitigated, but they don't understand it. One of the very interesting facts was we had three groups of people. One group of people had been recently through a wildfire event. They understood risk. That was the trigger that moved their attitudes to behaviours. So they implemented stuff. They had been through a risk. The other group were long-time landowners that had been around, seen a fire in the environment, didn't think risk was too much of an issue, hadn't seen a big fire, but through there, and their mum and dad used to do it this way, my grandpa used to do it this way. We had those people that didn't really see a big fire, but they had land use procedures in place. That's what they were going to do. And then we had the typical tree changes that had very little exposure to fire. And they were a really, really critical group. They've seen the smoke, they come from Sydney or wherever, from a non-bushfire area. They see smoke in the atmosphere, that's in the stuff on telly, that's about their exposure at all. No exposure at all. Those people weren't too bad because they knew what they didn't know. So we could move them along, nudge these people along the pathway a bit quicker over the program than what we could do in the middle group of people. The problem with the middle group of people is they didn't know what they didn't know. They made a lot of assumptions about risks. They just assumed that this was always going to be the way. They were the hard people. They were entrenched in their behaviours and attitudes. They were the really hard people to work out. Consistently, they underestimated risk. Fire spread rates, flame heights, things like that. When you started talking to them about what the scenario would be, they were quite challenged. The program's been supported by actual burning on the ground. So we do little grassland burns, get them the fire gear, put gloves on. Consistently, everyone said, it's hotter and smokier than I thought it would be. Everyone said it. So everyone underestimates not actually the fire, but the atmospheric conditions around the fire. So hopefully that helped them understand if a big fire comes through and you're doing asset protection, that's a different story. So we basically come up to 8 target areas within the community engagement program of what we're trying to do. Some really good research coming out of the CRCs. There was some good stuff out of Queensland natural hazard work out of cyclones that we brought across. And that was the first part, community profiling process. Our current processes in determining how rural communities look at risk is all pretty well consistent throughout the state. And it's pretty well consistent all the time. It's every year we throw out media, we throw out publications, we go to the local fair and we've got a stall there. What this really come out to be is you need to do your profiling, which I did earlier on. I did a little bit of profiling there. What we found is that communities that have been recently exposed to a fire threat were much more able to digest the information. So instead of us looking at broad scale engagement as we do now and tick the box, and it's an issue about government funding that they get an annual cycle package, is basically if there's a fire, that's when you go in. That's when you engage. For the 2 years after fire, that's when you throw your resources into engaging with that community. And then you work with that, because you got them on the hook. And then you work with that community for the next 5, 10 years to nudge them to a better outcome. Next fire over there, same thing, you throw your resources into that. It takes resources, commitment time off the agencies, yes, but that's when you're going to get your bang for your buck. Why is Blue Mountains so good as a community for fire? Because they're exposed to it. The Blue Mountains World Heritage Institute did a lot of work with these guys after the 2013s and brought everyone along that train ride. And then they have another fire, they bring them along. So it's looking at how we educate people about risk and risk profiling bushfire when they're ready to receive the information. One of the biggest challenges in the community profiling area is that the most vulnerable people are the ones we're not reaching out to. Different language groups is really, really important, lower socioeconomic area. So we're not looking at those community connectors. So as an agency, I'm moving forward into community engagement. I sit there with my badges and I start doing that community engagement. Really wrong process to be looking at. What we need to do is step back as an agency and then go, right, where are our community connectors? Where's our church leader? Where's our land care coordinator? Where's our local, maybe council representative? But who are those community connectors out there that can reach out to those vulnerable people that don't necessarily engage, and how can we draw them in? Where's our disabled manager over there? So that's where we've got to really start looking at how better community profile engaging. So looking at community connectors, looking at the people that can actually draw people in and get a room of 30 people. The nudge theory, we've just gone through that. So that's all about looking at how we just don't pick up a community, tell them what they want to do. That's what you do, you'll be safe. Doesn't work. So we understand that it doesn't work. We appreciate it doesn't work. We accept that it doesn't work in human behaviour. Community is receptive, that I was just talking about there, the right time. A very big response about lessons learnt. So another issue around community engagement and talking about risk profiling, and it's the issue of a neighbour listening to another neighbour. If you've got people in the community that want to talk and feel free and comfortable in talking about their experiences, that is bucket loads for the rest of the community. They love that stuff. They want that personal connection. They want that sensory, you've been through it, tell us about it. Okay? They don't want an RFS officer or a consultant or anything like that sitting up here going, oh, well, this is what goes on, this is what happens. Okay? Very little engagement, very little ownership of it. But if it's a neighbour, another fellow community member doing it, and this is all these community connectors, and community engagement, you'll get a lot more value out of that stuff. Risk is starting to be subjective and starting to be owned by the individual. Issues around evacuation and stay and defend, really good one. Obviously, the policy's been changed about stay and defend and evacuate. Basically, 80% of the people say, a ballpark figure out of all the research, 80% of the people say they're going to evacuate. It doesn't really happen. 20% of people say they're going to stay and defend. That 20%, yeah. Basically what happens, it turns out to be about 50-50. So 50% of the people stay and defend. The other 50% are either, 50% of the people evacuate. The other 50% are late evacuees or stay and defend. That's where we're at. Let's try to work with that human behaviour. Let's accept that human behaviour. Let's try to nudge that maybe a little bit better in terms of more evacuees early. But instead of just saying everyone evacuate, let's accept that human behaviour that we're not going to get it and work policies and procedures and operational standards around that fact that we're not going to get everyone to evacuate. So it's really saying, community, we understand how you respond and react. We're going to start designing our suppression or response or our recovery and resilience operations around humans, around what community does. It is a flip, it is a change, it's a lot more resources, a lot more time, but it works. Once again, providing tools to understand wildfire risks. So we don't want to try to get a whole heap of pyromaniacs at a young age out there. So there is a balance in between that, telling them too much and not telling them enough. But people need to understand the fundamentals of how fire spread works, how fire behaviour works, so they can own that risk. Understanding what fire protection measures are. Once again, it's that devil in the detail. They know that there's fire protection measures. They know they need water. I've got a dam 100 metres down the paddock. That's the water. They know they need water. That's the fact that you need water right near your asset and accessible water near your asset. That's the issue. But they don't understand that relationship. So things like that, that's the kind of very 101 stuff of what we need to start getting out to people. And of course, there was, after the St Ives fires, as many of you know, there was the big issues around livestock management, pet management, and stuff like that. So there's been a lot of work in that area as well. But that's still an ongoing thing. People don't think about that next level of what do I do and how much time it takes to get ready before a fire to move livestock or where you're going to put it or what you're going to do with your pets. So it's really about a timing issue of early decision making, and we all know about that. So that's nothing new there. That's the end of the presentation. You've got 6 minutes. Any questions? No, thank you very much. Tony? Yeah, I think they are. Yeah, just for the online guys. Tony at the front here.
Thank you. That was very good, Duncan. It certainly exceeded my expectations. So,
Well, thank you.
so my question. A lot of the messaging, well, I'd say most of it, is built around a common theme of fire is our enemy. We should be scared of fire. I'd like to think we're better off teaching people to accept fire and learning how to live with it. So do you think the agencies have gone down the wrong path? They're doing the wrong thing?
I think it's a community issue. I don't think it's necessarily an agency issue. We've had a very strong conservation movement over the last 40, 50 years talking about how fire is best out of the landscape. And I think there is a shift to understand that fire is a part of the landscape, and that fire is not necessarily a bad thing. It comes down to a lot of a great examples. If you go into ecology, if you go into ecology training at university and work out there, you don't get taught fire ecology as an ecologist. It's a big gap, but fire is such a powerful positive and negative tool in the environment, especially around biodiversity. So ecologists themselves don't understand that relationship with fire and how it is used and applied in the environment. So there's a fundamental expertise and professionalism there that doesn't understand how fire works, and research is going into that area. And there's a fundamental move in society to start understanding that we live with it. It is part of the society. We don't remove fire from the landscape. And fire is not fire is a really big, important point. Just because it's red and it's hot and it's burning doesn't necessarily mean there's certain objectives meet. So in terms of intensities of fires and stuff like that. So low, moderate fire is not a bad thing at the right time, in the right vegetation, under the right circumstances. And it's understanding when that's applied and bringing the community with us. If that's an RFS objective, look, RFS are really, really concerned about asset protection. That's their focus. And we're moving more into that land management area of fire application in the landscape, which hopefully we may bring RFS along the ride with it, but we'll just see.
Supplementary question. Bungle has had an awful lot of cultural burning around. Did you get any sense of the community reaction to that?
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of questions around cultural burning. The way I answer that question is cultural burning's got two words in it. It's more about the first word than the second word. So and it's all about your objective of what you're trying to reach. So if you're doing asset protection or ecological burn, you're looking at the burn objective, okay? And a cultural burn may not be the right way to apply the fire to the landscape to get that objective. But if you're looking at engagement, you're looking to bring cultural people into the landscape, then yes, cultural burning is a pathway. With cultural burning, you've got to have a cultural intent done by cultural people for cultural outcome. So it's very difficult to show that first one, that cultural intent issue. So a lot of cultural burns fall into the ecological basket just by their nature and are done under a permit of the HRC or the Real Fires Act. So it's a very difficult one, legislative-wise, insurance-wise, with cultural burning. There is a place for it, just not everywhere. And we just got to make sure people understand the objective of what they're trying to reach and what fire application that means they've got to apply to the landscape to get that objective. Yes, it's up the back.
Just want to firstly say thank you for that presentation. That was really excellent and refreshing, and I'm very interested in your focus on triggers for people. Like, what are the triggers you're finding that are getting your community to make those decisions? And then the second part of that is, are you envisaging or finding that post-COVID, with everyone's increasing disrespect and mistrust of authority, how does that impact on the way we do education?
Yeah, good question. So in terms of the triggers, clearly past experience was a massive trigger that really changed people's attitudes to behaviours, they lived experience. And secondary was that storytelling. So that storytelling from neighbouring community members, because it personalised it. And we had a couple of workshops where we all knew there was one neighbour that basically got burnt out, was quiet for about 3 workshops, and then that fourth workshop she felt comfortable in talking up, and everybody engaged. And you can see from that point, she was able to tell her personal story, and everyone owned that then. Then the risk started to get owned individually. Other triggers, sensory triggers, are really, really critical. People, human behaviour, we want to see it, smell it, and this is the late decision making that comes into the play. People don't understand that risk when the fire's a kilometre away. Oh, it's over there. They can see the smoke, maybe not embers starting, but the embers start, and you're probably too late already to evacuate when the embers start. So that's the issue, that sensory input for your brain to go, bang, that's what I need to do. And it's trying to get over that hurdle of getting the sensory input to make people make the right decision, or better decision, better outcome. What was the second part? Just the mistrust with authority after COVID. Have you started to think about how that will Yeah, look, I think that's just rural landowners. They're just farmers. They're all out there. They have very little interaction with government or agencies or anything, and they work between themselves as a community already. They got to go and put a fence up. They don't go and get a complying development certificate. They just talk to their neighbour and put it up. If they want to build a dam, they just build a dam. They want to clear veg, they just clear veg. You know, they don't have that interaction. So they don't. That's just their nature of a rural community. They're not engaged with government so much. So it's just that simple fact that someone comes, there's a fire, comes, whole heap of badges and stuff hanging off them and say, right, we've got to do this, this and this. They go, never see you again. We'll do what we want to do. And that's that connectors, finding those community connectors that we can work with and bring those to the side and say, look, this is what we've got to do, get the community to help us get these outcomes. And if we've got some structure pre-hand, you know, we've got emergency operational centres or evacuation points to go to, we can start helping that process work a bit smoothly. Zero. We're off. Thank you very much. Downstairs.